used to teach college freshmen how to analyze texts. I would show them a scene from a romance movie with ominous music playing over it, and then show them a scene from a horror movie with romantic music playing over it. And I would ask them to tell me which genres they thought the films were. They always chose the genre that the music indicated rather than the genre of the visuals that appeared on the screen. They said the romance with ominous music over it was a horror film, and the horror with romantic music over it was a romance. They got the genre wrong. And the students were surprised. How could they misrecognize one for the other when we understand the genres of horror and romance to be opposites? Genre is defined as a set of characteristics and expectations that make kinds of stories recognizable. The set of characteristics that make something a romance versus a horror would seem to be pretty different. But as my students demonstrated, it's easier to be wrong about genres, even genres that seem opposite, than we think. Simply by describing a plot, it seems really clear which of these films is a romance and which is a horror movie, right? An undead man forms a deep, unhealthy attachment to a teenage girl. The most popular guy in school asks a nerdy girl to the prom, and she says yes. This is because genre inheres in expression, not in plot. Stories, that is, plots, aren't intrinsically one genre or another. Genre inheres in the expression of the story, not its plot. That's why my students took their cues from the music in the film clips I showed them rather than the content of the scenes. Hi, my name is Roan Parrish, and I write romance novels. I also write horror, and before I did either of those things, I wrote my dissertation on the Gothic in American literature. So, why do we think that romance and horror are opposing genres? Romance is interested in connection, emotion, empathy, happiness, love. And it's historically been a genre written by and for a majority female audience, although that is beginning to shift. In a patriarchal society like ours, all of these things are systematically denigrated. Patriarchy teaches us that there is nothing more embarrassing than women and their feelings. So romance, even though it is far and away the best-selling genre in publishing, is dismissed and maligned. Horror, to the contrary, explores fear, hopelessness, amorality, nihilism, and menace, and has traditionally been associated with male authors and readers, although that too has shifted significantly recently. In a patriarchal society like ours, these emotions are taken far more seriously than the emotions of a romance. So, love versus fear, sex versus gore, wooing versus menacing. Romance centers women's voices, horror silences them, often literally. Opposites, right? How could my students confuse a story written by Stephanie Myers and directed by Catherine Hardwicke with one written by Stephen King and directed by Brian De Palma? But let's back up. How did we get here? How did we get to this place where we've been trained to recognize romance and horror as opposites, especially because romance and horror, spoiler alert, used to be one? The Gothic novel, once called the Gothic romance, emerged during the Romantic period. Like other works of Romanticism, it focused on the strong feelings of pleasurable terror, or the sublime. The sublime takes us beyond ourselves. It's all about extremity. Something that pulls us into an extreme is pleasurable, but also terrifying, impressive, but also overwhelming. It's more than beautiful, it's ecstatic, blowing us open. The Gothic novel generally had female main characters, was explicitly marketed to women, and was considered low art as a result. Sound familiar? It should. These are the same criticisms that are levied against the romance genre today. The Gothic novel also featured those main characters under threat. They involved violence, terror, isolation, amorality, and menace, just like the horror genre does today. Indeed, Gothic novels were thought to pose a risk to readers because of the combination of their chills, horror, and thrills, romance, because it was thought that citizens experiencing any strong feeling could potentially disrupt the status quo. Okay, back to the present. So, given that the Gothic genre combined romance and horror, how did they come to be considered opposites? We can thank the Gothic's incredible popularity for that. When the bubble of the Gothic genre popped, it splintered into what we've known since as subgenres. As methods of distribution became more readily available, penny dreadfuls and serial newspaper fiction evolved to tell stories of horror, suspense, and mystery, while mass market and category romance and romance comics developed as their own subgenre. For the first time, romance and horror were in entirely different publications from one another, and they developed separately into the genres as they're recognizable today. To the degree that now we think of romance and horror as being so different that when I tell people that I write one, they are shocked to find out that I write the other. Someone who writes horror, that does not fit with their notion of a romance author. Someone who loves romance, that doesn't fit with their notion of a horror author. These two genres that we've been trained to see as different used to be one, as I said, and they can be one again. And what might that allow us to see that we didn't see by thinking of them as opposites? It allows us to see what might be horrifying about the romance Twilight and what might be romantic about the horror of Carrie. It allows us to challenge our binary notion that something can't be both. In 1818, Jane Austen, a romance root for many contemporary romance readers, wrote Northanger Abbey, a Gothic novel. At the time of its publication, a lot of people received it as a parody of the then super popular Gothic novels. Its main characters, Catherine and Isabel, are avid Gothic novel readers. They see threats typical to the Gothic novel everywhere, even in places where the explanation turns out to be romance. But what if we look at Northanger Abbey not as a parody, but as the expression of a brutal material truth? For many women, in the time when Jane Austen was writing, participating in romance and marriage was a horror. By combining these genres, we tap into the most powerful thing about the Gothic genre. It makes us experience strong feelings. Fear and love are two incredibly strong emotions, and it makes sense that we would seek out stories in order to survive one and delight in the other. Both are genres, I'd argue the most likely genres, that you would choose when you want to feel a particular emotion. That makes them artistic tools of emotional catharsis, the experience of emotional release through art. It just depends which emotion you need to have a catharsis via at that moment. Horror has room for romance. Romance has room for horror. There are no genre reasons why they need to be kept boundaried. In fact, I would argue that romance's genre expectations make it a place that's particularly hospitable to horror because of its emotional promise. I will end happily. That's the only hard and fast rule of genre romance. Within that framework, characters can go through any amount of angst, horror, threat, or change, and the reader can find it all cathartic because they know that in the end it will be ameliorated. Horror is also particularly hospitable to romance. Horror is about having what we value most threatened: our families, our sanity, our sense of self, our very bodies. What could be more fertile ground for threat of loss than a grand romance? Horror doesn't have to end tragically either. That's not one of its genre markers. And in fact, a great deal of horror ends with the victim emerging triumphant. To that point, there has been an interesting recent boom in the subgenre of monster romance and erotica. Monster erotica takes the monsters or villains from horror: Bigfoot, Frankenstein's creature, aliens, tentacled beasts of the deep, and it casts them in the role of the dark, erotic, sexual partner of the human main character. This recent trend speaks to the breadth and depth of many of our desires and shows one way in which we are already moving closer to closing the gap between horror and romance. After all, that Gothic classic, Count Dracula, was both a monster and a seducer. But it also speaks to the tendrils of horror that were already hidden in even the swooniest of bodice rippers. Consider the stereotypical alpha hero of romance novels. He's framed as desirable because of his unusual strength, his massive size, his threatening demeanor, and his ravenous sexual appetite. That is, he's framed as desirable precisely for the characteristics of a monster in a horror movie. I want to be clear, I am in no way suggesting that we do away with genre. Rather, that tales that dwell between genres or in the places that they intersect have the ability to tell new stories. They create space for artists to do work that we haven't seen before, but which contains within it familiar signposts of genre that readers will recognize and be drawn to. We've only scratched the surface of diverse voices and stories, suppressed voices, liminal voices, stories where something would be erased by fitting it into one genre, stories that insist on validating love in times of horror and the threat intrinsic to loving. And in the future, I believe that a combination of horror and romance is one of the places these voices will shine. For example, as a queer creator, love, who I love, how I love, is subject to horror in and of itself. For many people of color, queer people, disabled people, neuroatypical people, the material and systemic conditions of the world as it is today are a horror. Acknowledging that the white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism of our Western society are the makings of horror for many of its participants insists that we view horror differently going forward, insists that we view romance differently. Love makes us stronger than we ever thought we could be, more generous than we ever imagined, and more ruthless than we've ever needed to be. Love, pushed to extremity, can become horror, but it can also be the thing that we need to overcome it, escape it, defeat it. When I was a kid, I read voraciously. Twice a week when my mom would go to her aerobics class at the YMCA, she would drop me off across the street at the public library, and I would wander through the 3-story building, trailing my fingertips along the shelves, plucking off anything that caught my interest. I didn't actually know that they were arranged by genre or category, not really. I read The Outsiders and Interview with the Vampire, and I never thought of them as different kinds of books. I thought Ponyboy and Louie had a lot in common. I felt like I had a lot in common with both of them. Later, as a PhD student, I wrote a dissertation that was interested in what might happen if we let ourselves read all books as if they were Gothic. What, I wondered, could we learn from allowing ourselves that kind of genre blending? Now, as an author, I am wildly in love with genre. But what I love most is the incredible possibility that is promised by choosing to view things as having similarities, as being in conversation with one another, rather than being boundaried. Going forward, we can choose to mash it all up, to sew it all together into a Frankenstein of genre that is bursting its seams with love and fear and awe and pain. We can choose to wander through the library like children, running worshipful fingertips along the shelves, imagining all the ways the characters might help each other and us expand. Thank you.